I ranked all of the base game cards in Terraforming Mars in a huge tier list, and obviously there are some standouts that you always want to play around, and some shitters that you need to avoid in almost any scenario. But what if that wasn't the case? What if all of the cards were playable and none were too overpowered? Back in December, I pitched my ideas on how to nerf the absolute best cards in the game to a state where they wouldn't dominate every game anymore, and today I will propose my own balance changes for the absolute worst cards in the base game of Terraforming Mars. How can we buff these cards to an acceptable level? Of course, same as in the first part of this series, I want to make sure that these cards keep their identities intact. I will not make underground detonations a generically good but boring heat producer, for example. These cards should feel the way they are right now, but play much better. But let's get started. We start off this video with a notoriously bad card, Aerobrake Ammonia Asteroid. The problem with this card lies in the fact that it's a bad deal for just the production, and in the early game, when you most likely want to get the production down, you won't have a microbe collecting card. But even if you do, the 2 microbes AAA grants are not enough to lift the value of this card to an acceptable level. My solution is twofold. First of all, we're going to make it just a tiny bit cheaper, 3MC cheaper in fact. This increases its value as an early game production card by just a bit. But the bigger change will be to the microbes it provides. We're going to make it so that the amount of microbes you get scales with your heat and plant prod. You add both together and get half of that in microbes. This means that if AAA is the first production card you play, you still get 2 microbes. But if you have played Mohole already, you get 4. With this change, AAA has more combo potential and doesn't just lose all of its value after the first 2 gens. It's also just a much more interesting card. Aquifer pumping is way too expensive for what it does. If we compare to the standard project, it only pays off after 3 uses, and compared to its huge upfront cost, only delivers a significant upside after 4 uses. If we compare it to the fair cost of an ocean, so subterranean reservoir, it only barely pays off after 4 activations and only delivers a noticeable upside after 5. We need to change that. Obviously, it needs to be more expensive than a standard project or a basic ocean placement card like Subterranean Reservoir, but not by as much as it is right now. So let's lower its upfront cost by 2MC and its activation cost by 2MC as well. That way it is still more expensive than both an SP or Subterranean Reservoir, so you'll never use it for just one ocean, except if you have insane amounts of steel and nothing to do with it. But starting with its second activation, it's cheaper than an SP, and starting with its third, it's beating out single-use cards. Given that you can use steel on this card, I think this makes it a really great tool to increase just one of the 3 parameters, and really strong if you have kelp on hand. There are cards in this game which set a precedent. How much is 1 power prod worth? Well, somewhere around 7 MC, since Power Plant, the simplest card that grants 1 power, costs 4 plus 3 MC. Same goes for Dust Seals. 1 VP is roughly worth 5 MC, since Dust Seals cost 2 plus 3 MC. But if we all agree that a VP is worth that much, why is a card that grants a point at that price even considered bad in the first place? Well, the problem about Dust Seals is when you need to play it. 3 oceans often go down super quickly, and in the early game you want to set up your economy and not bother with playing point cards. That's why my simple fix is simply increasing the max parameter to 5 oceans. This will not propel this card into S tier or even make it somewhat impactful, but it will increase the chances for you to draft or draw this card at a time where you actually want to play it, and or have some discounts for it. Equatorial magnetizer is a card that can be useful in certain circumstances. If you've played Quantum or Mass, or both, and are therefore left with tons of power prod, the temperature is already maxed out, and you have some steel left over, you can play this card and score basically some free points. But this is a very niche use case, and even in this one, if the heat is not already maxed out, most of the time you're better off just keeping the power prod and using it to increase the temperature. You know, get your TR that way. Power prod is costly, and playing Equatorial magnetizer and then using it to turn power prod into TR is just not a good deal. But what if we make it so that it doesn't hurt as much losing the power prod? I propose to buff magnetizer by changing the action to grant you 2 instant power in addition to the TR. This way, if you play it in the late game, you'll even be better off than before in terms of power. It could also be used to kickstart Development Center or Bumper if you played a card that granted you too much power prod. All in all, it would improve the action and therefore buff the card in an interesting way. And it would allow you to terraform even more by using the excess power as heat. Food Factory is a notoriously bad card. Its problem is that plant prod in the early game is just too expensive and hard to get. That means this isn't a great card to play early on. But since a lot of its value stems from prod, it's also not great to play later in the game. So when changing the card, in my opinion, you either make it a good production card or a pure point dump. I want to go for the former. Let's change Food Factory to be an action card that allows you to sell one plant for 5 MC. This means that you don't necessarily need plant prod in the first place to make it work. Also, it pays off faster since you can activate it immediately. It yields 1 more MC per gen and provides you with a stall action. Of course, now you risk not being able to use it due to plant destruction, but I still think this makes Food Factory considerably better. How do we change Hackers to be a good card? There's 2 things I don't want to change about the card. First of all, removing MC prod from one of your opponents and gaining some yourself. That's the whole point of the card. Secondly, the negative victory point. If you hack someone else, you should get punished for that. So let's instead make it so Hackers does not use up power prod. That was its main problem anyways. It made the card too expensive and increased its opportunity cost, since you could have used that power prod for something else. Obviously, we cannot leave the cost where it is, so let's change it to 7. That will make Hackers a great production card in 2P, and even in 3P it will be worth it to play in the very early game. Next up, we have to talk about Industrial Microbes. Some of you think this card doesn't even belong in F tier, and yes, it's maybe the best one in there. It still isn't a great card though, and costs just a tiny bit more than it should. But I have an idea what to change about it to make it more usable and not overbuff it. First of all, we'll make it just 1 MC cheaper. That brings its cost and fair price of the sum of its effects perfectly in line. Then, and I like this change a lot, we will give it a power tag. This will give it 2 more niche use cases. Firstly, as a great card for Diversifier with its 3 tags, and secondly, as a useful card for Thorgate, a corp which usually only can apply its discount on pure power production cards. This, in my opinion, is already enough to lift Industrial Microbes firmly out of F tier and at the same time gives the power tag a little bit more variety. Magnetic Field Dome is just not a good deal. Let's break it down. It costs 5 plus 3 MC, the power prod it consumes costs on average another 14 MC, so in total we get to 22. For that we get 12 MC worth of plant prod, if you think Adapted Lichen is a good representation of what a plant prod is really worth, and 1 TR, which is worth roughly 8.5 MC. That totals out to be roughly 20.5 MC. But as I mentioned, it hinges on a cost calculation based on Adapted Lichen and release of inert gases. 2 underwhelming cards that without combo potential are not great at all. So Magnetic Field Dome already yields less than it should, and that's comparing it to 2 bad cards. To be good, it relies on getting power prod very cheaply and having steel left over. In my opinion, this card needs to be cheaper. In exchange, we can make it more niche. I like that it relies on power prod so heavily, but not that it is so expensive. So let's make it cost 1 power prod less, but in exchange you need to pay 3 power instantly as well. This means that you actually need to own more power prod than before, but the card will consume 1 power prod instead of 2, significantly decreasing its real long-term cost. I don't think these changes will make Magnetics super strong, but they will make it so that it feels like a real bargain in very niche cases, which is what I wanted to achieve. Next up, let's talk about Martian Rails. The problem with this card is that it is expensive to get down, since it costs 13 plus 3 MC, plus roughly 7 MC for the running power prod. It requires you to develop power prod again before you get this card down. The power prod cannot get tapped, and most importantly, it doesn't pay off enough in most games. Cities do not come down in mass early enough for this card to work. A simple fix here, and one that certainly does not propel this card into S tier or anything, but makes sense lore-wise and makes the card more viable, is to let this pay back 1 MC not only for city tiles, but also for special tiles. Yes, this makes it very similar to red ships, but it just makes sense lore-wise to also connect the special tiles via train. The inhabitants of Mars need to move to most of the special tiles on a regular basis anyway, except maybe to the nuclear zone, But still, it makes sense. And on the gameplay side, special tiles often come down in the early game, so this would make Martian Rails a much better mid-game development card. In addition, I'd propose to make the card 2MC cheaper. 13 plus 3 plus 7 is just too much. With these two changes, I believe Martian Rails is a niche but solid card that can sometimes pay off very early on. When discussing dust seals early on, I alluded to the fact that there are cards that set a precedent. Dust seals established the fact that 1 VP costs 5 MC. Because of power plant, we know that the fair price of a power prod is 7 MC, and micromills establishes the fact that heat prod costs 6 MC. Problem is, micromills is such a low impact card with so little combo potential that more often than not, there just isn't any reason to pick this up in the draft and play it. But same as with dust seals, I don't want to change its price. No, here we need to go a different approach. Let's turn to the flavor text of dust seals for an inspiration on what we'll do. The text states that micromills are small, mass-produced windmills that convert some of the ever-present wind to heat. For me, this sounds like the card windmills. So these micromills are awfully similar to something that produces electricity and which we have plentifully here on Earth. Why don't we just give micromills the same tax as windmills? The power and the building tag. Firstly, this allows you to pay for it with steel, and then it also adds a much needed power tag that does something other than providing power prod. Something this game lacks severely. It also makes micromills a great card for Thorgate or Diversifier in general, and just grants more combo potential overall. A very small change, but in my opinion enough to push this card out of F tier without changing a fundamental aspect of the game, the basic cost of 1 heat prod. I always complain about how weak the power tag is. I just did with micromills. There's almost no combo potential for it, with Thorgate providing the only effect based around it, and Power Grid and Power Supply Consortium being the only cards that somehow rely on it. And the problem is, the former, Power Grid, is super bad. It almost never grants enough power prod to justify its super high cost. I have a somewhat simple but also drastic fix for it. We will make it so that Power Grid will grant 1 power prod and 1 instant power. This will basically give you 1 more whole turn of production and also transform this card into a makeshift heat producer. Also, if you need power for an action like physics or ironworks, Power Grid will immediately provide it, given that you have enough power tags. In my opinion, this is a neat way of buffing this card. Next up, another bad power tag, Power Infrastructure. This card is super niche and basically only gets used if you get tons of power prod through Mass Converter or Quantum, and either don't want to increase the temperature because you're going for an all-out engine, or the temperature is already maxed out. Still, it's one of the cards that probably needs just a teeny tiny buff. It's already almost good enough to be in D tier in my opinion. My change to this card is simple, but so far unseen in Terraforming Mars. I would add the wording, "Do not put a colored cube on this card after performing this action," on the card. This instantly makes Power Infrastructure the best stalling card in the game and gives it a new use case. I think this is all Power Infrastructure needs to become quite strong and, to be fair, quite annoying, but I dig that. Red Suits has 2 problems. First of all, it just isn't impactful enough. A point and 1 MC prod does not make me pick this card over other ones in the draft. Secondly, it's not good enough of a deal. 1 MC prod costs roughly 4.5 MC, and 1 victory point costs roughly 5 MC, so 9.5 in total. Red Suits with its 9 MC cost just does not stand out enough compared to that, especially since it also has a particularly annoying requirement that often prevents you from playing it in the early game. Let's just make this card 1 MC cheaper and reduce its requirement to just 1 city. Overall, this will make the card much more easily playable in the situation in which you'd actually like to play it, and also make it a better deal overall. What protection does Security Fleet actually grant you? Nothing! It's a lie! You invest a shit ton of resources into a fleet of fighters and opponents can still steal and destroy your resources however they want. So to fix this obvious lore oversight and to buff this shitty card, we make it so that in addition to the current effect, Security Fleet protects all your non-planned resources as well as your non-planned productions. No more raiding with our fighters flying above. Also, since I think this is quite a niche effect, we're going to lower the base cost of the card by 3 MC. I think in combination this makes Security Fleet a playable card for anyone who's going for an engine with a lot of titanium prot. The problem with Soil Factory lies in its cost. It's just a bad deal. It grants a plant prot and a point which combined have a value of 17. And again, that's using adapted lichen and dust seals as a baseline. Not great cards to begin with. But it costs 3 plus 9 to buy and play, and the power prot costs 7 MC. That adds up to 19. This just makes the card horrible. Now, we could lower the price to make it a better deal, but to fight the lack of good mid to late game steel sinks, instead I'd like to keep its price roughly the same and add more value to it. So we're making Soil Factory 1 MC more expensive, and we're adding another point to it. Suddenly, it's not 2 MC too expensive, but actually 2 MC cheaper than what it should cost if you add together the parts. I don't think this would make it busted or anything. It's still just a point card that grants a bit of plant prot. Not impactful, but at least a good deal. Next up, special design. The problem with this card is that there are so few cards that are so busted that playing them a gen or two earlier justifies paying 7 MC more. Kelp farming and the Venus animals are notable exceptions. So how to buff it? The easiest answer would be to just make it cheaper, but there's not a lot of room for improvement there. And if you make it 0 MC, it just becomes a media group cash grab. Instead, and this is also meant to make it more unique in comparison to Adaption Tech and Inventrix, we make it so that special design allows you to increase or decrease the global parameter requirement of the next card by 3 instead of 2. Suddenly, special design can be insanely influential and allow you to play cards significantly earlier on its own. I think it can be a real threat in the draft this way. And we arrived at the end, at the worst card in the entire game. Underground detonations. What the heck will we do with this card? First of all, we need to lower the cost of using it. And secondly, we need to increase the speed at which you get the benefits out of this card. An action that grants you production loses in value super fast. You really don't want to continue activating such a card through the mid game, meaning that underground detonations itself loses in value super quickly. So first of all, we're going to make its activation cost only 6 MC, a huge change from 10 MC. But that's how bad this card is in its original form. And then, in addition to that, it will grant 1 instant heat as well, making it so that the card pays off quicker, and is playable later in the game as well. I think this makes total sense lore-wise as well. An explosion generates heat instantly and not just slowly over time. Let's compare the cost of the old underground detonations against a generic heat producer like Import of Advanced GHG, which costs 12 MC to buy and play. With its huge upfront cost of 9 MC, the discount on 2 heat prot of just 2 MC means that the original underground detonations takes 5 gens to eke out a tiny advantage compared to Import of Advanced GHG, which also has tons of combo potential. And why would you want to activate underground dets 5 times? At that point, you've spent nearly 60 MC and arrived at 10 heat prot in Gen 5. What an incredible waste. The new version makes it so that after just 2 activations, it's already cheaper than a generic counterpart, and in addition to that, you've also gained 2 instant heat, making up for the fact that in theory, you could play the generic cards together in 1 gen, while Underground Dets took you 2 gens to develop the same amount of prot. I think with this change, Underground Detonations is a great early game heat producer that I would love to see if I go for a rush. And that was it. All F tier cards buffed to hopefully an acceptable state. Let me know what you think of these balance changes. Do you think I overtuned some of these cards, or did I maybe not do enough? I'd love to discuss this with you in the comments. But yeah, if you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and consider subscribing. Also, please follow me on Twitch, where I stream Terraforming Mars live regularly. Have a good one and goodbye.